I moved into my house in 1985 after the birth of my second daughter. From the start, there were strange goings-on. My living room door handle would rattle every night, but because it was next to the front door, I put it down to drafts. My husband was home one night and I was wide awake trying to fall asleep when I watched a monk walk into my room, round it, and out through a wall. I was shaking my husband awake, shouting, "Look, look, there's a monk!" But he was too late to see it and said I was dreaming. We argued about it. 6 weeks later, I'm home with just my 2 kids, and again I go to bed and the monk appears again, reading me the last rites. At least that's what I thought. I shouted that I'm not Catholic, and he disappears instantly. Then my eldest daughter said to me one day, "I like that old lady." I asked her which old lady, and she responds, "The old lady that comes in my room to read to me every night." My husband said she was just dreaming, and we left her at that until I heard her quietly speaking one night. She was sat up in bed, eyes wide open with her arm held out like she was holding someone's hand, and looked directly at someone. I asked what she was doing, and she just put her arm back down, laid back down, and went to sleep. I thought, yeah, she's dreaming. When she mentioned the old lady again, I asked her to describe her. She said she had gray hair and round glasses. Anyway, we never really talked about it again, and I knew if there was a problem, my daughter would tell me. 3 years later, I had my son, so I moved my girls to another bedroom I'd previously used as a junk room that would always give me the creeps, as once I heard a woman laughing hysterically in there, and when I opened the door, there was no one there, but the rocking chair was rocking by itself. I just closed the door and thought, fine, whoever it is having fun. Then the real activities started. My youngest girl would tell me about a man who would stop her from coming to my room at night and made her go back to bed. She swears to this day, over 30 years after it happened. Then one night I heard my youngest girl shouting for me over and over, so I run upstairs to go into her room, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My girl has stood up, out of bed, having a tug of war with her quilt with something. The quilt is in the air with nothing at one side, holding it up, and it's being tugged by my daughter and by whatever else is hold of it on the other end. I think I was in disbelief and say typical mom stuff like, "What on earth is going on?" My daughter says, "You won't let me have my quilt." At this point, I realize I'm not imagining this, and neither is my daughter, so I shout, "Get out of my child's room and do not ever bother her ever again. You're not welcome." Then what I can only describe as 3 lines of light, wished so fast it was a split second, went over my shoulder and out the room. I put my daughter back to bed and told her to shout if she needed me. I look back and so many paranormal things have happened and are still happening in this house. I can't believe the lack of money and a mortgage. I bought this house after 2 years of living here. I've managed to keep me here for 34 years and keep so calm about the stuff that's happened. I put the experience down with the monk as dreaming, like I said, because even if I thought it was true, it's ludicrous. Why would a monk be in my room? Until 2 years ago, I started researching my area and found out the land my house was built on actually belonged to a monastery. It was early summer 2010. I only remember because my 21st birthday had just passed and was finally legal to hit the bars. It was a Friday night and I was up having a drink at a bar that my cousin David was the bartender at. It was a small town bar that outside of an event like a band or other entertainment, usually it stayed pretty quiet. It was very early in the evening and I had just gotten out of work for the night working at a McDonald's in another small town less than 10 miles from the small town I lived in. I was on only my second drink of the evening when my phone rang. On the other hand was a friend of mine from my childhood, James. He was calling asking if I wanted to come over to his brother's house to join them for a night of poker, smoking, and drinking. It sounded like a good time in my book, and since I was literally only 1 sip into my second gin and tonic, I agreed to make the drive into Toledo. Most people know where Toledo is, but for those who don't, it's a city in the northwest region of Ohio, about an hour south of Detroit. It was about a 20-minute drive from my small town and figured it would be a good time. I stopped at home to grab some cash. I only ever about took 10 to 20 bucks with me to the bar to make sure if I ever got caught up having a good time drinking, I didn't screw up and have too good of a time and end up closing down the bar that evening. I left my house at 11:05 p.m. I remember that distinctly because I had called James to tell him I was on my way as they were going to wait for me and start the poker game at 11:30 p.m. We always played a tournament style of poker game where we all put our money in at once, got equal amounts of chips, and played until there was only one person left with any chips who then got to keep all of the money. I took my usual route over to my brother Eddie's house as I had done so many times before. We had all gotten together, a group of anywhere above 4 to 6 of us, and we played poker in Eddie's basement at least twice a month, usually more. I had just gotten to the corner of Oakdale Street and East Broadway. I was sitting at a red light in an area that's nothing but residential housing outside of the elementary school that sat at that exact corner. I'm sitting up looking at the red light waiting for it to change, which always seemed to take absolutely forever coming from this direction. When I noticed something in the sky that from my vantage point was partially hidden directly behind the red light, it was a very bright white light that seemed to be pointing straight down, almost like it was a helicopter using a spotlight to identify something, but much, much brighter at the point of origin. I heard absolutely nothing after rolling down my windows and knew this could not possibly be a helicopter or I'd absolutely be able to hear it. Wanting a better view, I pulled into the parking lot of an ice cream shop that sat directly across the road from the school I was nearby and got out of my car to try and figure out what this thing was. When I got out of the car, I stared up into the sky and immediately found it again. It couldn't have been a plane because it didn't have the right shape. It was more oval than anything. Most stories you hear like this say it's circular, but it was definitely an oval shape. I almost thought perhaps it was a blimp given the shape, but it seemed far too large to be a blimp even by the measurements of some everyone knows about, like the Goodyear blimp. Plus it had no decals or identifying marks, either silverish or grayish. After what felt to me about 30 seconds or so of looking at this thing, my eyes started to burn. Not burn in the sense of extreme burning or anything like that, but almost like that feeling of when a bug flies into your eyes and causes them to water up. I closed my eyes and began to rub them. My eyes are closed at this point, so obviously all I see is black. After finally getting my eyes to stop bothering me, I tried to look up again and find only for it to be gone. I looked all around but couldn't see it anymore. This is a very densely populated neighborhood with houses, trees, etc., able to obscure any view of things you'd look up into the sky to see. After a little less than a minute, I decided, oh well, time to go play poker. I get over to Eddie's house, which is about 4 blocks from where this had taken place, to knock on the basement door. A few moments go by and no one answers. I decide to go to the front door and knock. Figured maybe since I'm probably 5 or 10 minutes early, maybe they were upstairs on the PlayStation. I knock on the door, but still no answer. Finally, I start knocking very loudly on the door, almost pounding. Eddie finally answers the door and says, "Man, why are you knocking on my door this late?" I look at him, honestly confused, and said, "Well, your brother said to come over and come play cards with you guys." He stares me over what felt like an eternity and finally responds, Yeah, man, I know he did. He called you like 5 or 6 hours ago, man. It's 4:30 in the morning. How late did you think we would be playing?" This scared me a bit, as from when I had remembered, at this moment it could not possibly be any later than 11:25 to 11:30 at most. I attempted to play it off and say, I guess I must have lost track of time. Can I use your bathroom before I head back home?" He agrees and tells me I should splash some water on my face as I look like I'm either drunk or haven't slept in a week. I walk into his bathroom and my eyes are absolutely bloodshot and almost looks like I have 2 black eyes. To this day, I have absolutely no idea what happened to me that night. I have no explanation for the lost hours worth of time, how I could not have possibly noticed that much time being passed, or how on earth something that felt like my eyes being irritated by a mosquito or something similar flying into my eyes. I don't want to pretend to know what it was and explain it or even assume that whatever it was that I saw that evening had anything to do with it. But it's creeped me out ever since. From the moment I started speaking, I would tell my parents about Dodd. I was obsessed with him. I would tell everyone about him. I would talk to him. I would play with him. My parents assumed it was just an imaginary friend. Lots of kids have them, and considering I'm the youngest of 4 boys, they guessed my brothers didn't want to hang out with the little kids, so I made my own friend. It began to escalate when my mom would find me, 2 or 3 years old. sitting alone in my room having conversations with thin air, and responding as if someone had said something, nodding, listening, laughing as if he told a joke. I treated Dodd like he was a real person, and I really genuinely believed he was. Part of me still does. I would demand Dodd have his own seat and his own plate of food every single day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Anytime we left the house, I'd scream and cry if they forgot Dodd in the house. He'd have to have his own seat. He ended up having his entire toddler car seat because I was so scared of him getting hurt and he had to be picked up, set in his seats and buckled in just like they did to me. My parents had to talk to Dodd the way they talked to me, or I'd get upset that they were ignoring him. I have memories of Dodd, genuinely seeing Dodd with my own eyes. I'd swear on my life that he was really there to this day. He was about a foot or so tall, the size of a small child like I was, but he was a pure white, mostly featureless bipedal bear. He had no face. He had an outward bump where a muzzle would be and 2 indents where he should have had eyes. He didn't wear clothes and didn't have real paws or hands. He almost looked like a gummy bear with round, tapered hands and feet and no details whatsoever. But he was solid white and not transparent. He didn't speak verbally. It was more like I just knew what he was saying. I also don't remember him walking anywhere or moving at all, really. But I'd look away and look back and he'd be in a different place. I'd swear on my life, on everything I know, that he in some sense was real. I don't know how old I was exactly. I'd guess maybe around 4 or 5. I went outside with Dodd because he wanted to show me something. He'd led me around the back of the house to a square panel of sorts that I had never seen before. It was like a tiny door, held with a simple hook latch. I opened it and inside was a concrete floor, a really low ceiling and a dusty old red tricycle. The classic little one you're probably imagining. It was full of cobwebs, and I couldn't see anything other than a tiny bit of the concrete in the tricycle because the sun was adjacent from where I was. I climbed in the little cubbyhole and just sat there with my knees to my chest, and I can still vividly remember seeing Dodd standing just outside of the door, facing me. I didn't know this spot existed. I had no reason to. Who tells their toddler about a spooky concrete hole in the back of the house that's only accessed from the outside? Recently, I told my parents about that memory a few months ago, and they said they purposely didn't tell me or my brothers about it because if you go inside that area, about 2 feet in, the concrete drops off into open pipes, wires, and insulation, and since there's no access from the inside, it'll be really hard to find us if one of us fell in. I didn't forget about Dodd for a single day for 6 years. I never let one of his meals go by. I never ignored him for a whole day. I never let us go on a car ride without him for 6 years. But eventually we had to move houses. I had lived in the same house this whole time, and it was the final day we'd ever be at that house, and we were getting into the car to go to the new house. My mom picked me up and put me in the car, and then turned to pick up Dodd and bring him too. When she did, I immediately started crying and angrily said Dodd's not coming. I apparently stopped talking about Dodd altogether that day, and for years I'd get extremely upset and angry if someone mentioned him around me. My mom told me she researched the house we had lived in, and apparently there was a little boy years before us that had died when a gas pipe bursted directly in his face, and as scary and weirdly fitting for my faceless friend as that sounds, I don't know if I buy into it personally. I was never afraid of Dodd, and I don't think of him as scary now. I think it's extremely strange, obviously, especially considering that he appeared as a featureless bear, and he stuck with me for 6 years, much longer than most imaginary friends. I think it's mind-boggling that he brought me to a place in the house that I had never been in, and that the knowledge of it was deliberately kept from me. Sure, it could absolutely be some absurd psychological thing, or it could be some strange kind of ghost or spirit. But either way, I believe in and still think kindly of Dodd, and no matter what he is, I'm grateful to have had a strange childhood friend. The story I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of 2012 in my country, Portugal. At the time, I was living in the north with my parents and my brother, and had extended family from my mother's side living in the south, namely my grandparents, uncle and 3 cousins, 2 girls and a boy who was 17 at the time and 5 years older than me. Let's call this cousin George. George was a regular teenager. He was outgoing, practiced sports, was a talkative person, a good student, and got along pretty well with me and my family. In said summer, we went to my grandparents' house in the south to pass our time with our relatives living there. Everything was normal at the start. Whenever possible, my uncle and cousins went there to visit us, usually having lunch with us, spending the afternoon at the house and having dinner. George was his typical self in the first week or two, being very talkative, playing cards and PlayStation with me and my brother, going for walks with us, basically a very normal behavior. At some point in the summer, George went on a trip to a city in the countryside of England to go meet a couple of friends, two sisters around his age who lived there with their parents, and who he had met in Portugal when they were there for vacation. His stay there was supposed to be like a couple of weeks, however. At the end of the first week, something happened. My uncle received a phone call from the girls' parents. They were asking my uncle to go meet them as soon as possible and go pick up my cousin because he wasn't feeling well at all and was showing a strange behavior, which led them to believe that he wasn't mentally able to come back on his own, hence the need of my uncle to go there. So my uncle went to England the next day and brought George back immediately. When me and my family met with George again, we were stunned. He wasn't the same person who had left just a week earlier and who we had known for all of our lives. The altercation wasn't physical, it was psychological. I'm not talking about a teenage mood change. The behavior he was displaying was deeply upsetting. If I could describe it in a word, although an understatement, would be apathetic. George didn't talk, didn't move, didn't show any feelings, and his eyes were dead. The only sign of life he would give would be an occasional groan when we would try to talk to him. It was obvious that he was needing medical help. The days that followed his return consisted of trips to the hospital. My uncle took him on an appointment to a psychologist, which showed ineffective. He then took him to neurologists and psychiatrists who were also baffled with his state. George had his blood sampled since his behavior could be explained by having been drugged while in England. But no, the results didn't show anything out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, he was prescribed a series of medications. First week had passed and no signs of altercation. Second week, more pills, more appointments, more blood tests, and same results. George's days kept consisting of him sitting in a chair, not talking to anyone, moaning and sometimes crying softly. My family is Christian, and my grandmother was particularly very religious. She started suspecting that his behavior couldn't be explained by science, nor was it a result of some hormonal change or an obscured neurological disease, and frankly, so was I. I knew my cousin, and that wasn't him. I know it sounds ridiculous, but when all the scientific explanations and treatments went out the window, we started believing he was being in a situation similar to a possession, even though he wasn't speaking in different languages, crawling on the walls, spinning his head, or levitating, like what happens in certain movies. But it was very telling. So one morning on the third week since George's return, my grandma managed to get holy water from the priests of our local village. That same day in the afternoon, when I was in the living room with my cousin, I saw my grandma coming in with the holy water with her and positioning behind him while he was sitting on his chair. My grandma started sprinkling him with the holy water and saying silently some prayers to no opposition from him, just with his now typical soft groans. My 12-year-old self was quietly watching this with knowledge of what this ritual was about, hoping it would be effective. After about 10 minutes, my grandma was done. Peter Stills showed no apparent change. Later in the afternoon, my brother, now in the living room with us, and a couple of more family members displayed a chessboard on the table and asked if someone wanted to play chess with him. I can play. We were shocked. It was our cousin. He got up and went to play with my brother. It was a stunning sight to behold, and we couldn't believe it. Not only was he speaking, he was also actively interacting with someone after almost a month. In a matter of a day or two, George went back to being his older self. Since then, no one's ever talked about this with him. And to this day, I don't know if he was actually a recipient of the state he was in and of what my grandma did to him. But I don't believe I'll ever ask. From time to time, I still think about what happened in that summer of 2012. It definitely changed the way I view certain things, mostly on a spiritual level, and made me truly believe that there are many things that are simply out of reach of our comprehension. This happened to me when I was about 11 years old. It was the 90s. I had lived my whole life in El Paso, Texas. The culture is rich in folklore and religious beliefs. Many Hispanic families have stories of the paranormal. One legend popular is the legend of the Weeping Woman, aka La Llorona. The legend of La Llorona, Spanish for the Weeping Woman, had been a part of Hispanic culture in the Southwest since the days of the conquistadors. The tall, thin spirit is said to be blessed with natural beauty and long, flowing black hair. Wearing a white gown, she roams the rivers and creeks, wailing into the night and searching for children to drag, screaming to a watery grave. No one really knows when the legend of La Llorona began or from where it originated, that the tales vary from source to source. The one common thread is that she is the spirit of a doomed mother who drowned her children and now spends eternity searching for them in rivers and lakes. One night, just like any other night, I lived in a trailer with my mom and dad. My youngest brother was staying with my aunt this night. I fell asleep watching Jay Leno as usual, and when I woke up, I was on the sofa in my living room. The time was 4 a.m., which illuminated from the stove in the kitchen. The television was off, and normally I had a light on, but this time it was pitch black. I woke up, and I heard a horrible screaming that was coming from far in the distance. The screaming was coming from a ditch that was a few feet away from my home. I heard it and thought I was hearing things. I asked myself, am I dreaming? Then I started to hear the animals outside howling and whimpering. These animals that I speak of are cats and dogs. As the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I have never experienced ever before. It sounded like I was in a big hallway, and a woman was screaming her guts out down that hallway. Then, in all the screaming, I started to make out words. Those words being said by whoever this was at 4 a.m. screaming their guts out shocked me. The woman was saying in Spanish, "Oh, my children." In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was asleep. I turned on the closest light and looked around. The screaming didn't stop. In fact, the screaming only got louder and closer. I questioned my sanity at that moment. Was I going crazy or hearing things? Then I thought to myself, this is real and the animals are responding to it in a negative way. So I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in a moment like this. I ran to my mom and dad's room. I reached for my mom and shook her awake wildly. She woke up slowly, and to my amazement, the screaming faded away as she woke up. I started asking myself, what the heck is going on? And then I told my mother, "Mom, do you hear that screaming?" The crying lady. My mom was half asleep as she said, "Go back to sleep, it's just your imagination." I told her, "No, this is real, please listen, don't you hear it?" My mom quickly just said, "You're dreaming, go back to sleep, it's going to be okay." By then, the screaming had faded long away, like if whoever was screaming knew that an adult was awake. I was terrified as I returned to the living room and quickly turned on the television as I left most of the lights on as well. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I heard and witnessed. I was treated like a crazy person whenever I told my story. It got so bad that I kept my experience to myself. To this day, I don't care what people think of my experience. I know I heard what I heard. A couple of years later, it happened to me again. This story takes place after the first incident with a woman known as La Llorona. Not much happened after the first time I heard her. An incident occurred with my aunt about a year after the encounter. According to my aunt, they were sleeping and suddenly there was a horrible sound coming from the ditch located in front of their house. There's a street in between the ditch and the house, but her house and the ditch are really close to one another. It was about 2:30 a.m. when my aunt was awoken by a screaming of a woman coming from that ditch. She figured maybe somebody had been hurt or was being attacked. She walked out to the front yard looking towards the ditch and saw that there was no woman. My cousin, her daughter, walked out the front as well, asking her what was happening. My aunt, of course, had no idea as the screaming grew closer. Then they saw her, a woman in a white dress. The only thing that shook them to the bone was that the woman had no feet and was clearly floating. One other feature that threw them off was that this woman had no face. They both just turned after seeing that and ran inside their house. My aunt locked the door and called the police. The police showed up minutes later and took their claim seriously. El Paso PD was soon looking at the area where this woman was seen and heard screaming. The police soon returned and said that there was no evidence that a woman was there. They looked at the area where the woman had been seen walking, and not even footprints were found. One of the police officers even asked if maybe my aunt was dreaming everything that happened. The next day is when I went over to visit, and I saw my cousin like I had never seen her before. She had black bags under her eyes, and she hadn't slept since the incident. I asked her what happened, and she said she saw what my aunt saw. The screaming woman with no feet and no face. I took her a while to sleep normal again. She never heard or saw of La Llorona again. But to this day, she won't deny that she had witnessed something that she couldn't explain. Unlike my cousin, I don't have the luck of avoiding La Llorona. It was in the early 2000s when I worked here in El Paso, Texas at a local supermarket named Big 8. One of the shifts that I worked was from 3 a.m. to 12 p.m. The store was located in the lower valley of El Paso. In the back of the store is a small ditch. One early morning at about 4 a.m., I had the back doors open and I was taking the empty milk crates outside in the back. I was working with two other guys at the time of the incident. One of the guys' names was R. Thought it would be funny to close the back doors and lock me outside as a joke. When I heard the doors close shut, I knew he was just messing around. I thought to myself, I'll just stay quiet and wait for him to open the doors again. I wasn't going to give in to his joke or trying to scare me. I stood by the door smiling and thinking to myself, he's not going to scare me. I could hear R laughing on the other side of the door. I thought to myself, well, the joke's on him because I'm not scared. About 1 minute later in the far distance, I heard screaming. Just a complete guttural screech, and I thought to myself, it's the same screaming that I heard when I was 11 years old. The screaming got louder and closer to me. I felt a chill down my spine, and I felt that I was being watched by some unseen force. I felt a sense of hopelessness. It was a feeling unlike any other. I started pounding on the door. I yelled for him to let me in. There's somebody out here. I pounded my fist and started kicking the door, screaming for him to let me in. I could still hear R laughing on the other side of the door. I started to kick the door harder. The screaming was now coming from right behind me. Just then, R opened the door and said, "What is that?" Just then, I ran inside and locked the warehouse door. R asked, "Why was that lady screaming? Did she need help?" I told him that I don't think that was a lady. I told him what had happened to me when I was younger. R told me, "Jay, don't you think maybe you're cursed, or do you think maybe she's following you?" I stayed quiet when he told me that. I couldn't work my shift normally after that, and it took me a few hours to get over what happened. I admit I was scared, and maybe R was right. What if she was following me? There was one more incident that took place after. In 2015, I started working as a custodian at Cedar Grove Elementary. Behind the school is the border highway. Then the Rio Grande, of course, covered by a huge metal fence that separates Mexico from El Paso. I worked the night shift from 2:30 p.m. to 11 p.m. One night I was stuck working with another custodian until midnight. Right when we were about to leave, we do a walkthrough of the school to make sure all the doors are locked on the outside. I worked with another custodian named C. She always told me that she had never believed in ghosts. Until that night, I can say. We walked to our cars, and just as I was about to leave, I saw that C had opened his hood of his car. Then he asked me, "Hey Jay, can you give me a jump? My car battery's dead." I told him yes, of course. Just as I stepped out of my car, a loud screaming came from the Rio Grande. All of the animals in the nearby neighborhood started howling and crying. Once again, the screaming resembled a woman screaming her guts out in the hallway as it echoed all over. C looked at me and said, "Oh my God, is that a demon?" I told him, "No, C, that's La Llorona." He looked right at me and said, "No way, she can't be real." Then I said, "I've heard it before." Then C responded, "Hurry, please, let's get out of here." I gave him a jump, and just then we saw a border patrol jeep speeding towards the screaming woman. And just then I thought to myself, I can record this and share it with the world. I took my phone out, And just as I hit record, the screaming faded away. C and I looked at each other and he said, "What in the world?" "Sorry, Jay. I'm leaving before that evil witch comes back to get us." We both left. And the very next day, C was telling everybody at work how we had heard the witch crying the night before. That was the last time I encountered her. I don't think it's the last, as I feel that she may choose who hears her or sees her. I have other paranormal stories, as I was part of a group here in El Paso, Texas. We've investigated many historical locations. I also got the chance to investigate with Amy Bruni and other celebrities that have visited El Paso. This is a whole other story for another day, but thanks for listening, and in time, I may have more stories to post about La Llorona. In my whole 24 years of life, I have never been on a train. Roller coasters, most definitely. But an actual train, no way. From the time I was little, when my grandma and mom would take me to Six Flags in St. Louis in the summers, I was beyond excited by the time I got there, simply from the sleepless night tossing and turning, from pure excitement of what I got to do the next day. But I always did whatever I could between the ages of 7 to 12 does. I had a blast at the park, then was asleep as soon as I hopped in the back seat of the truck when we left, not to wake up until we pulled into the driveway. I was never scared of roller coasters, not even the ones with a loop. I was always the one leading whoever was with us down the long path of the line you'd go through to get up to the ride. One by one, and coaster after coaster, I always knew that usually about halfway through our visit, I'd be too chicken for a certain ride that, still to this day, I've never had the balls to get on. The freaking train that takes you around the park. That's right, the choo-choo train. Why? I can't tell you for the life of me a single reason or even possibility as to why I'm so terrified of trains. Now fast forward around a decade to the time I'm 20 years old. I live in a small town in southeast Missouri, and my mom lives in the house right next door. Every so often I go next door and watch TV with her and my baby sister if I get bored. She also finally came to terms with the fact that I smoke quite often, and when my sister is visiting my grandparents across town, I'll sometimes come share a blunt with my mom. But this time in particular was all three of us. I'm laying on the couch. My sister is at her princess table in the corner playing with something, and Mom just came in from the kitchen with the plates of taco salad she just whipped up for us. She sits down and I randomly had it on that show, I Shouldn't Be Alive. About 15 minutes into it after she sits down, she said this, "You know, this reminds me of what you told me when you were about 3 years old." Thinking she was talking to my sister, I turned my head from the TV and she was looking at me. I said, "Huh?" She then went on to tell me that when I was 3 years old, I randomly started talking about my other family. Apparently, from what she told me, my two sisters, my mom, aunt, and our cat were all headed somewhere, and we had all died in a train crash. At first, I was laughing hysterically, a hilarious thinking that maybe she was messing with me. But then she swore to God that I randomly said that when I was about 3 years old. In that moment, something made sense that I've never in my life been able to find reasoning for. My fear of trains. Now, can someone help me with this? Could she be serious? I'll be 25 this year and still think about this pretty often, and I truly have no explanation for any of it. In 2018, the Saturday before Christmas, I was out on a birthday bar crawl on the Lower East Side. We were all getting a bit bored with the crowd and decided to go back to one of our and decide what to move on to next. Cut to me realizing I had 10 missed calls from various members of my family. My uncle had been rushed to the hospital and didn't make it. My uncle was the youngest of my mom's siblings and was more like an older teenage brother to me than an uncle. We grew up together in a very close family. I don't think I realized how quickly grief hits when you get news like this. The sound of my father's voice cracking and straining to get the words he didn't make it out of his mouth was more than I could handle. I crumbled into a pile of tears right in the middle of the kitchen. In a daze, I made my way back up to Harlem, trying to pull myself together and figure out what to do. I couldn't get anyone in the city on the phone. I couldn't get myself to call anyone in my family, so I needed to suck it up and get home that night. Mission accomplished. Flight change, bags packed with the help of my neighbor, and a couple of Klonopin to get me home. All of this to get to the point of the story. I'm barely able to keep myself together as I wait on the subway platform. The change of tickets and my lack of savings just wouldn't allow for a taxi ride to the airport. Just as I feel like I'm about to completely break down again, I notice a man in a lightly colored, absolutely beautiful suit. He had blonde, bobbing curls on top and shortly buzzed on the side. I turned to take a bit more notice than saw his face. Strange to say, but I can't recall anything about it now. It's a blank space and a very detailed memory. The only thing I can remember about his appearance was that it absolutely took my breath away. It wasn't in a, "Oh my God, this man is beautiful" kind of way. It was sheer admiration for the absolutely perfect and symmetrical face. So here we are, the only two people waiting at the stop on 145th. The man seems to be almost giddy with joy, as if he was seeing the world for the very first time. Not a crazed, forced happiness. He seemed as genuine as a child in Disney World seeing the Magic Kingdom for the first time. When we boarded the subway, he sat mirrored to me. I was in a far left seat, and he on the opposite side of the train to the right. It was quite crowded, but I looked up at some point before the 125th stop to see that he was staring directly at me. It wasn't scary, it was as if though he was waiting for me to finally notice him. All he did was look me in the eyes, nod his head in confirmation, and wink at me. It gives me chills to remember it. The comfort that washed over me felt like a warm embrace. I felt the security of a child who had scraped their knee, that feeling of mom making it all better. I was able to get myself home, head held high and without the help of Klonopin. I'm not a religious person. I have scuffed about God, and I felt resentful when anyone brings up their beliefs. I don't know how to explain it, but I have this deep feeling that I saw an angel that day. All alone and navigating through intense emotions, I truly feel this man was sent to me to give me comfort and strength to get home. It almost feels embarrassing to type this out, but I have no other explanation. For background, I am a 15-year-old Irish fellow called Ross. I come to school in Ireland. I am now in 3rd year. At the start of 2nd year, I knew a fellow who joined the school. I was in charge of showing him around, and we've been good friends ever since. He is Portuguese, and his name is Tiago. I'll call him T for the story. His school bag is fairly small, bright red. He is a bit shorter than me. His hair is quite short and brown in color, and this will become important momentarily. One day I was upstairs in my school. It was break time, and I was going to my group's usual spot. I turned a corner and saw T walking along the hallway. This was weird because at the distance I was from him, I would have seen him come up the stairs. I didn't think much of it at the time. I sped up to catch up to him. There was another corner coming up. He rounded and I followed suit, except he wasn't there. There was a staircase going back down in 2 bedrooms, one for the lads and one for the lassies, but no T. Considering how close I was behind him, he would have had to have sprinted towards and then jumped down the stairs or jog into the bathroom. If he went for the stairs, I would have heard. He must be in the bathroom, I thought. I sat at the bench and waited. T was the first other person in the group to arrive. He rounded the corner and left his bag down. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't in the bathroom. I asked him if he had already been up there, to which he answered that he hadn't. He had no reason to lie. Now, I know what you're all thinking. It was probably someone else. First of all, the person I saw looked exactly the same as my friend from the back. Second, no one else in the school has that bag to my knowledge. I haven't seen anyone else with it, that is. And third, the only place the person could have gone without sprinting down the stairs, which I would have probably caught a glimpse of anyways, would be the bathroom. No one came out of the bathroom that I didn't see enter already. Finally, my friend is a fairly distinct character. Not many people have the same body build as him. Now I know this may not be terrifying, but I truly do wonder if this was some sort of glitch in the Matrix. Potentially me seeing him moving in the future,